Hello, Jesse. We're going to take a look at your 5 characteristics posting here. And so let's just share the screen and get right into it. See what your posting looks like first, just to make sure you got everything up there successfully. Looks pretty good. Temperature, contrast, and hardness looks pretty good. So let's kind of bounce back up here. So the order in which these are laid out, the direction, intensity, and temperature, or the color, contrast, and hardness, they do somewhat flow that way when you're considering building the lighting solution. Lighting is just a puzzle, really. When you have a need to go ahead and light something or manipulate light for that matter, if you're in a location where you don't have the ability to move lights around, but you have to sort of modify the lights, we're still thinking about these 5 characteristics. We're still thinking about where the light's coming from. Is there multiple light sources? If there is, which one is going to act as our fill light? Things like that. We do consider these all in the order in which they're sort of laid out. Direction is always going to be the first thing that we sort of consider, because that establishes the key light, where the key light is coming from. The most influential light source in the image. It tells us just exactly where the shadows are going to be going. It establishes, even subconsciously for the viewer, things like time and depth and all sorts of other things, compared to like an omnipresent lighting situation where you can't tell where the light's coming from. This can be sort of unnerving at times when you see images that are that way, and they tend to lack emotive quality in a lot of ways. They look very clinical in that way. They're usually images that are designed to be purely informational, not to express a particular emotive quality whatsoever. So direction is the first that we will consider, because it establishes that key light, and the key light is the first thing we want to be aware of when we're looking at the light within a photograph. And so this front, the first direction being, smack in the front there, it's gonna create that almost omnipresent light source because it's so straight on. But as soon as you start to move it into the other sides, you can see here, and that automatically, as soon as you move it to the side, that you're starting to get such a huge difference between this and this, because you're establishing a direction of where the shadows are coming from. And when you get to the position number 3 here, which is the side, and by the way, this is a wonderful photograph. It's quite beautiful in the sort of abstraction you've been able to create here, with the multiple arcs and curves and the use of the soft focus or out of focus in most of the areas, and then having just this one crisp area here. It's very well seen. But the light coming from the side here is contributing to that. That said, we still do have a subtle bit of information here, just a tiny bit, which keeps this from falling off into the void. That's also very important within the photograph. These sort of glowing edges, this is all very beautiful. Right here is something that we want to kind of pay very close attention to, however. An area like right up in here, where the vessel sort of like pops and hits just the very edge here. Notice how it creates a lot of tension, because it's almost like a car wreck. If I put my hand right here while I'm talking, if you can, I wonder, I'm trying to remember if you guys can actually see me when I'm talking here. You probably can. Anyway, if I have my hand just like this, how much tension it creates, as opposed to my hand all the way off. It's kind of like a car crash. It can hit the top of the composition like this. That's what's going on right here, and it creates an unnecessary amount of attention, gives it to it. We don't necessarily want the attention to be right up here. We want it to be where you mean it to be, which is probably somewhere right in here, where all of the activity is happening. So the quick solution there would be to allow it to crop, to go off, which you could either tilt the camera down just a little bit or come in by a millimeter or two to crop that off, and you would solve that problem right away. Be mindful of that. Photography is an interesting tool to compose with because it's different than others. With like drawing, for instance, where you have to make a mark and then make another mark. You're sort of building the composition. You're adding things to it to build it up. So you're slowly growing the composition as it goes. So you're in control of it that way. In a photograph, you look through the finder, it's all there immediately, all at once. And it can be overwhelming because you're like, where do I begin looking? Direction is helpful because it lets you see things for just the breaking it down for the shadows and the highlights. That said, we still need to be aware of the entire picture plane, the edges of it, and then start the process of reducing, eliminating things from our field of view, either through throwing them out of focus or cropping or physically removing them until we're down to only the essentials, only the essential lines, only essential shapes and textures, and so on. You're doing a really good job here using the objects to break up the space. So I say that as a kind of a refresher, not as like a criticism. Here we're having a little bit of the same thing happen as we notice. Let's kind of find that one again. I sort of breezed past it when my hand touched there it is. Right in here where we have the area of focus. That again is doing very same thing that the other one was doing, where we had the jar that was up at the top. Here we have the focus sort of hit right on the side here, which is drawing attention over there. It's also something that we want to be mindful of, where the focus is of the image. Is it where we want the viewer's eye to rest? Because that's where it's going to try to be pulled to. So we want to be aware of those things when it happens. It's definitely not an arbitrary choice. See how this being soft over here transforms that, or no, that's off the image. How this being not hitting the image and this being softer over here, how that helps. There's no detail here, so our eye isn't sort of obligated to look at it as much. It's there, our eye sees it as part of the composition, but we're not being sort of pulled to it continuously. These are all about composition. The project itself, it looks like you're having a very good time solving these things. Like, I mean, this is a fantastic example of using shadow produced by objects within the photograph using just a single light. You can see how complex a lighting solution you can get, even by just using a single light source, unfiltered, undiffused, just shining a light and modifying where that light is coming from. You can create this sort of depth in the lighting solution there. So it's pretty cool. It never stops amazing me what we're able to do there. This is an interesting, also another interesting way to go about the intensity project, where you're doing the dual lights. It is important to always be certain to start with the key light and then add the fill afterward, because you want the key light to establish where things are going to. You don't want to have them both on at the same time. This is not something that I recommend. I know it's not universally done. I know a lot of photographers who will just turn the lights on and start manipulating both of them at the same time. But when we're learning, I think it's a good practice to start with just the key light and establish that, then take note as to where you need that key light. Because if the key light just exists the entire time, it's almost as if it just sort of it's there and it's harder to move. I've noticed that when students are learning these things. So keep that one off, turn the key light on and move that to where it needs to be in your image. Then look before you turn the fill on, and then get it on to just the area that you need to, bearing very close attention to how bright that is. You always want that fill light to be visibly lower in intensity than the key light. You don't want them to compete with one another. Here they're similar to each other in terms of the brightness, but it looks like what you've done is you've moved that fill light over. And so what's happening is you've got the key light producing this and the fill producing this, yet the fill is producing a thinner shadow and this one thicker. And so it is giving you a bit of variance there. Intensity wise, they do look like they're still very much the same. And if they had been the same width, they would have been competing with you. It would have been this sort of butterfly feel that tends to look a little too symmetrical. So even though the intensity wasn't quite far enough away, I think you pulled it off here because of the thickness and where that fill light was coming from. It's a tricky thing to learn these things. I don't take for granted that these are not a challenge to figure out, even though they seem on the surface to be very straightforward. These are difficult assignments to pull off, especially with such limited subject matter and limited tools to use. It's good because there's fewer things you have to think about, but at the same time, it's a challenge because you don't have a lot to manipulate. So it does look like you are a little too close in terms of the intensity of the fill versus the key light, but it also appears that you are being visually mindful of that by using the fill light to create these thinner margins here versus the thicker, heavier margins on the key light, which is a good solution because sometimes you may not have control over the lights. If it's a situation where you are in a local place or a public space and you have the basic kind of idea of a key light and a fill light because light is coming from one direction and it's being filled in from another one, and they are kind of the same, and you position yourself so that you're getting the look that you have here so that they aren't competing. So one is heavier than the other one. So it's a good solution to something that you could have avoided if the fill light was lower in intensity to begin with. So let's see here. We're on the temperature side and got a lot of the warm here. The idea behind this one was going to be to modify the color and the white balance, or I'm sorry, the color temperature of our camera, color temperature settings of our camera. So the color temperature of the light, shifting it back and forth, and then at the same time, then modifying the white balance settings on our cameras to effectively get a mixture of different combinations that produce different color tones, shifts in color. It can be dramatic, it can be really subtle, but when you go through that and start to find some solutions that produce unique color combinations, they can be really valuable to you. It's also a practice in situations where you don't have control. You very well may be in a situation out in a public space or out on location where daylight is coming through a window and you've got artificial lighting otherwise lighting the space. So you have this warm light from the artificial, you have this cool neutral light coming in from the sunlight through the window, and it's mixing now. How do you choose to balance that? Your experience in working with this will help you do that. That's the point of running through all of these different things, is to familiarize yourself with those settings and the possibilities of those things so that you can have that experience going into it later on. So I don't know if you did go through a bunch of them. It looks like you have some variations here. I'm not seeing what the solutions were, where you posted them, but it does look like you went through some variations. We have some very warmness over here, and this looks more neutral and cool, where you have the light coming from this direction that's hot, or warm in temperature, and this one coming over where it's more color balanced. So that all looks pretty good. And again, I'm very happy about how you are using the principles of composition and design. Happy meaning, I'm pleased that you are expressing it and holding to those ideas. That's exactly what we want you to be doing. From class to class, from level to level, 100, 200, 300, all of this stuff is meant to be carried over, in the principles of design that we cover in the core and the foundation stuff. All of that is meant to be carried into these 200 levels, and this stuff is carried into the 300. We don't want to let them go just because we're not talking about them. We still want to incorporate them, and it's clear that you're using them. They may not even be in the forefront of your mind at this point, but they're happening nonetheless. Also, you seem to have no trouble with allowing things to run off edges, other than those few points that I made earlier about things getting too close to the edges without running off. This one is not so bad. Here, you don't have that happening. You're right on the edge of it happening. If it were any closer, it would be, again, that kind of tension that you build. Notice that the thinner there is, the less negative space there is between one thing and another, and the more tension it creates. That includes an object and the edge of your composition. So you want to pay attention to that always. Always. Let's keep going here. Contrast. Contrast is where we're using the reflector instead of the diffuser, and you'll notice how much different the variations look now from the fill light exercise, where we have the fill light adding the tone, as opposed to a reflector that's just capturing and throwing back light that's already coming from the key. Reflectors are one of your best friends out in the field when you're on locations and stuff, because, man, you can just catch light and bounce it into wherever you want. So get used to using reflectors a lot. You can see how soft and how sort of modulated the tones are from the one side to the other. It's not harsh at all. You get this beautiful sort of gradation going on from one to the other. You still have a lot of harshness coming from where the key light is, and we get into that to the next project or the next experiment, where we are diffusing the light then, which gives you even more control over how the light affects the shadows and the highlights there. But this is all working pretty well. I think maybe we could have cleaned up the composition a little bit more. Some of this stuff, clearly, if we were editing in Photoshop, where we would go in and we'd look at the image, and we'd make some real subtle corrections to, where things run off the edges. If that's not a problem, I mean, fundamentally your compositions are sound. There are some minor things like on edges and how close things are or aren't that could be improved on. We can always improve that. Also, we have a huge variation between the lights and the darks here. Here we have this very, very bright light over here, and an extreme amount of darkness here. Your camera seems to be handling it fairly well in the darks, but the highlights just got incredibly blown out here. And it's actually better to let the shadows go a little bit darker and not lose anything in the highlights, because once it gets to this, Photoshop can't save any of this, because there's just no information. It's always going to be that bright. Anything we add to it is just going to be a gray field. We can't do anything with it unless it has a tone or a texture to it. So be very, very mindful of the highlights particularly, and the textures or tones. This is about as bright as we want to get. Over here, this is pretty good. Over here, this just gets so bright, there's no information at all there. All it is a white field, which is somewhat distracting. If we were to put our hand over that, you'd see how much more of the image we're able to concentrate on, which is like right in here, all this cool stuff. It's hard to see almost because it's like, oh, let me get that out of the way. So these are some things that you'll want to pay attention to. Then you're getting into where we can diffuse the light now, which is very helpful because now you're going to get rid of some of that harshness that was giving your exposure some trouble in the last one, and you're also getting the direction that we were hoping to get. Here, where you're getting these extremely long shadows from the light being real low, that's really beautiful. You've got this sort of vertical that's happening. Even this, while it's still pretty close to the edge, it doesn't quite hit it because you've allowed this to go dark up here. I still think you could have given a little bit more breathing room there, or allowed it to just go right off the edge, making a choice about that. Making a choice about that, kind of, as I put my hand over it to look at it, it kind of appears to kind of come together a little bit better without the rim right here. We're able to get, again, down into this space here a little easier. Our eye can travel down to it. Photography is all about reduction. It's all about reduction, seeing what we don't need just as much as what is in front of us. Here you're handling that highlight a little bit better. It's still a bit harsh, this one as well. I didn't mean to jump to that one. These highlights are still pretty out of control here, but they're minimized because of their size and because you're so much closer. Here you're getting into more of an abstraction, so you can somewhat get away with those. Your color tone has shifted quite a bit here. Hopefully that was deliberate. And very nice use of a mixed color tone here as well. So I'd say that you're in a really good place here compositionally. It looks like your camera control is handling really well in terms of your focus. I'm not sure how much you know about depth of field at this point, but you're actually utilizing a shallow depth of field quite often here. The highlights that are being blown out, we're going to learn more about that in the later projects where we study control and aesthetics and being able to get into manual control to sort of modify those things. You're going to become more sensitive as we work more with the lighting to things like this, and noticing, that's getting too hot. Let's pull the light away or do something to calm it down a little bit, because we want to be able to have it under control for us. It's just sort of like, if you were painting, again, to like you have like a giant splotch of something that you had no control over and it just kind of gets in your way. That's what can happen with light sometimes, if there's too much of it that just sort of overwhelms the rest of the composition on that. But other than those few things, I think you're doing a fantastic job on this first one. And I'm very much looking forward to seeing where you go with this. It looks like you're enjoying yourself in the studio. You guys are interacting really well with your studio pod partners and that kind of thing. Just be sure to ask lots of questions, as you always do, and we'll see you next time in the studio. All right, bye now.